At 83, Paul Newman finally spoke their names, the men he loved in secret. There are only so many roles a man can play before the performance becomes a prison, before the applause starts to feel like silence. It was the summer of 2008. Paul Newman, the rebel, the legend, the blue-eyed face of American cinema, lay quietly in his home in Westport, Connecticut. He was 83, frail, fading, but for the first time, completely unmasked. He had spent a lifetime pretending to be the man everyone wanted him to be, the perfect husband, the ideal father, the Hollywood heartthrob. But in these final months, he no longer cared about scripts or spotlights. There was only one thing left he needed to do: tell the truth. Each afternoon, he would ask the nurse to place a Panasonic tape recorder beside his bed. Not to record a memoir, not to reflect on a career of awards and box office glory, but to speak the names no one had ever heard him say, the names that lived in his heart long after the camera stopped rolling. 7 men. They weren't rumors. They weren't fantasies. They were real. Real hands that once held his. Real voices that once whispered his name when no one else was listening. Real memories carried in silence through decades of denial, he said softly. They taught me how to love in a world that didn't want us to exist. This wasn't a confession of shame. This was a tribute, a remembrance, and a quiet rebellion. One last act of defiance against the lie he'd been forced to live. So if you think you know Paul Newman, if you think you know the secrets of old Hollywood, stay. Don't look away. Don't scroll past, because the third man he names is not just shocking. He's the name that Hollywood never wanted you to hear. This is not gossip. This is not scandal. This is the truth. And finally, after a lifetime of silence, he's ready to speak it. Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando, the chaos he could never tame. Paul Newman said his name with a strange kind of reverence, the way a man might speak of a hurricane that once passed through his life and left everything rearranged. They met in the spring of 1954 at a studio party where the air was thick with smoke, champagne, and secrets. Brando wasn't working the room like the others. He stood in the corner barefoot, a cigarette dangling from his lips, eyes scanning everything and everyone until they landed on Paul. That first night, they didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was something electric between them, something dangerous, something neither of them could afford, and both of them couldn't resist. A week later, Paul found himself on the back of Brando's motorcycle, racing through the dark hills above Mulholland Drive, the wind cutting through his hair. His arms wrapped tight around the man the press called uncontrollable. He remembered thinking, if we crash, at least I'll die feeling free. They lived like that for months on borrowed time in hidden places. No plans, no promises, just fire. Brando was a storm. He could be tender one moment, wild the next. He would cook dinner shirtless, dance barefoot to old jazz records, then vanish for 3 days without a word. And when he came back, he'd act like nothing had happened. Paul never asked questions. He knew better. Love with Marlon had to come without conditions. But even in that chaos, there were moments of impossible stillness. Like the night Brando whispered, "You're the only person I don't lie to." Or the morning they watched the sunrise from a rooftop in New York, their fingers laced together, invisible to a city that wouldn't have tolerated the sight. But love, especially theirs, had an expiration date. One afternoon, Paul received a phone call from a studio executive. There were whispers, photographs, a tabloid reporter asking the wrong questions. That night, Brando arrived at Paul's apartment with his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't sit. He didn't touch him. He simply said, "They know." Paul offered to leave town, to run, to disappear together. But Brando laughed, not cruelly, but sadly. "You still think we get to choose how this ends?" And just like that, it was over. They never fought. They never said goodbye. Marlon simply walked out the door and never came back. Not as a lover, not as a friend, just another Hollywood ghost. Years later, Paul would still catch his name in headlines. Another scandal, another marriage, another strange quote in a magazine. But to him, Marlon was always that barefoot man by the pool, biting grapes from a whiskey glass, looking at him like he was the only truth in a city of make-believe. He kept a postcard Brando once sent him. No signature, no words, just a picture of a burning house. On the back, in small handwriting, were 4 words. "We could have had this." Paul Newman never forgot him. He wasn't mine to keep, he said. But for a moment, he was mine to survive. James Dean, the fire that burned too fast. If Marlon was the storm Paul couldn't hold on to, James was the spark he never saw coming. They met in the quiet corners of a Warner Brothers backlot. Dean was still new, raw, restless, magnetic in a way that didn't make sense. He had a slouch in his walk, a cigarette always burning too close to his lips, and eyes that looked like they'd seen something no one else could understand. Paul was older, more polished, more cautious. But there was something in James that made him feel 17 again, curious, reckless, open. It started with small glances, inside jokes, moments where time seemed to slow. Paul once caught Dean watching him from across the soundstage. When their eyes met, Dean didn't look away. He just smiled, slow and sure, like he already knew how this would end. Their first kiss didn't happen in a bedroom. It happened in a car, rain falling, windows fogged, a silence between them too thick to ignore. Dean leaned in first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever get tired of pretending?" Paul didn't answer. He just kissed him, and for the first time in years it didn't feel like acting. They were never public, they couldn't be, but in private they were bold. Late-night drives through Laurel Canyon, coffee at all diners sitting just a little too close. Secret getaways to Palm Springs where they could swim, laugh, exist, even just for a weekend without lying to themselves. James was chaos in his own way, but softer than Brando. He didn't run from feeling. He ran toward it, even if it scared him. One night, lying on the floor of Paul's apartment, he said, "If I die young, promise me you'll tell them who I really was." "Not the image, not the jacket me," Paul promised, but he didn't think he'd have to keep that promise so soon. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean died in a car crash. He was just 24. The news hit like a bullet to the chest. Paul didn't speak to anyone for days. He locked himself in his study, pulled the blinds, and disappeared into silence. At the funeral, he didn't sit in the front. He didn't speak. He stood in the back alone, wearing the same leather jacket James had once tried on in front of a mirror, grinning like a kid. He kept two things after Dean was gone: a photograph, never published, never shown, of James asleep on his chest, tangled in blankets, sunlight pouring through the window. And a letter, just 2 lines, handwritten. "You make me feel like I might actually get to stay alive." It was dated 5 days before the crash. Paul never showed the letter to anyone, but he read it every year on the anniversary of James's death. He said later, "He was the brightest thing I'd ever touched and the fastest to disappear." They only had a few months, but Paul never stopped calling him what he was, his first real love, Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift, the shock that shattered the myth. Paul waited a long time before he said Monty's name out loud, not because he was afraid, but because the pain still hadn't softened. Montgomery Clift was the golden contradiction of his time. Beautiful, brilliant, broken from the very beginning. He didn't just play tortured souls on screen. He was one. When Paul met him in 1956, Clift was already a star, the kind of man who didn't walk into a room. He haunted it. His face was carved like a statue, his voice low and deliberate, every movement filled with a quiet ache. But it wasn't his beauty that stayed with Paul, it was his sadness. They first connected at a dinner hosted by a mutual friend. Clift was seated alone at the end of a long table, drinking bourbon and humming under his breath. Paul sat beside him. They didn't talk much that night, just listened to the music, shared a cigarette, said more in silence than most people ever say in words. Later that week, Clift called him. No greeting, just one sentence. "You feel like the only safe place in this town?" And so began something that wasn't quite a relationship and wasn't just a friendship. It was complicated, tender, fragile, something the world wouldn't have understood, and neither of them could fully define. Monty didn't let people close. He had secrets nested within secrets. He'd seen what Hollywood did to men like him, how it devoured them, rewrote them, erased them. But with Paul, he let a little light in, just enough to feel like love. They would spend entire nights reading poetry, lying on the floor, passing a bottle of gin back and forth like a lifeline. They'd escape to remote cabins, pretending just for a weekend that they were nobodies. One night, after a long silence, Clift whispered, "If I die young, make sure they know I didn't go untouched." But the world was already closing in. The studio found out, not everything, just enough. They didn't fire him. They didn't confront him. They did something worse. They erased him from the inside. Suddenly the calls stopped. The roles got smaller, the smiles more forced. He started drinking more, sleeping less, speaking in riddles. Then came the crash, May 1956. Monty wrapped his car around a telephone pole, leaving Elizabeth Taylor's house. His face was shattered, his jaw wired shut. His beauty, the currency Hollywood had built him on, was gone. But Paul said it wasn't the accident that broke him. It was the silence that came after. The silence from the people who once called him a genius. Paul visited him during recovery. He brought flowers, sat beside him, read aloud from their favorite book of poems. Monty didn't say a word, just stared out the window, blinking slowly like someone who had stopped expecting anything from the world. They drifted after that, not out of anger, but out of grief. Grief for something that could never survive the machine around them. In 1966, Montgomery Clift was found dead in his apartment. Official cause? Heart attack. But Paul never believed that, he said quietly. Monty didn't die in 1966. He died the day he realized the world would never let him love out loud. After his death, Paul found an envelope in a drawer back home. Inside, a photo of the two of them, blurry, off-center, smiling in a sunlit kitchen. On the back, Monty had written, "I was never brave, but with you I thought about trying." And Paul, even all those years later, still broke down when he read those words. Montgomery Clift wasn't just the third name on his list. He was the name Paul had carried the longest and buried the deepest. Anthony Perkins. Anthony Perkins, the secret that chose survival over love. By the time Paul met him, Anthony was already famous and already hiding. Psycho had just made him a household name. His performance as Norman Bates had terrified America. But what the world didn't see was that the real fear had always lived off camera. Inside him, Anthony Perkins was delicate, soft-spoken, too polite, too pretty by Hollywood standards. And everyone around him, agents, directors, publicists, worked overtime to make sure no one mistook that softness for what it was. Queerness. He had been taught from the moment he signed his first contract that everything about him had to be rewritten. Walk differently, speak deeper, smile wider, date women, never linger too long when looking at another man. And above all, never get caught wanting anything. But he wanted Paul. They met backstage at a charity event, a moment so ordinary Paul almost didn't remember it until Anthony touched his elbow to steady a dropped glass and didn't pull away fast enough. There was electricity in that touch. Not lust, recognition. They spent the night talking on a rooftop, feet dangling off the ledge as Los Angeles blinked beneath them. Anthony asked strange questions. Do you believe in parallel lives? Do you think people like us get to be happy anywhere? Paul didn't have answers, but that night they didn't sleep alone. Their time together wasn't loud. It wasn't reckless like Brando. It wasn't aching like Monty. It was quiet, careful, full of codes and glances and unspoken rules. They never stayed in the same hotel, never rode in the same car, never left a note with their real names. Even when they were alone, sometimes Anthony couldn't fully relax. He was always listening for footsteps, always watching shadows. Paul once asked him, "Don't you ever get tired of hiding?" Anthony replied, "Hiding is the only thing keeping me alive." And he meant it. He had seen what happened to others. The whispers, the careers that vanished, the headlines that bled you dry. He didn't want to be a martyr. He just wanted to work, to survive, to disappear inside characters because it was safer than being himself. Eventually, he pulled away, not with cruelty, but with apology. He met a woman, married her, had children. Hollywood exhaled as if he'd proven something. But Paul knew the truth. Anthony hadn't fallen out of love. He had fallen deeper into fear. Years later, when they saw each other again at an industry event, Anthony walked past him without a word, but his hand brushed against Paul's in passing. A second later, Paul found a folded note tucked into his jacket pocket. It read, "In another world, I never let go." Paul kept that note in the same box where he stored truth. Some people get to choose truth. Some people don't. Paul had to choose truth. Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen, the rival he couldn't hate. They were never meant to get along. Steve was everything Paul was not. Rougher, louder, looser. He smoked in interviews, drove like he wanted to die, showed up late to every set. And yet somehow America loved him for it. The press loved pitting them against each other. Newman versus McQueen. The polished rebel versus the street kid. The gentleman versus the outlaw. And at first, Paul bought into it. He rolled his eyes at Steve's attitude, called him reckless, said to a friend once, "He acts like he's never been told no in his life." But under the annoyance was something else. Curiosity, attraction, attention that pulled whenever they were in the same room. Too sharp to ignore, too dangerous to name. Everything changed during a weekend retreat for a charity event in Big Sur. The producers had insisted they share a cabin to build chemistry. They said it was cold that night. The fire crackled, the whiskey burned. They argued first over acting, politics, motorbikes, anything. The kind of argument where neither man really wanted to win. They just didn't know how else to talk. And then suddenly it wasn't talking anymore. It was a stare that lasted too long, a silence that pressed against the walls. And then Steve reached forward fast, unapologetic, and kissed him. It wasn't soft. It wasn't romantic. It was hungry, frustrated, like years of pretending had finally found a way to exhale. They didn't speak of it the next morning or the one after that, but something between them shifted. On set, they were sharper, electric. The camera loved them together. The world called it chemistry. They called it nothing because Steve didn't do love, he did thrill, he did heat, and Paul knew better than to try and change that. They met in secret a handful of times. Always spontaneous, always brief, always behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Once Paul asked, "Is this just a game to you?" Steve answered, "Everything is except this." But he never stayed the night. Years passed. Steve got married, then divorced, then married again. Paul moved on or tried to. They didn't speak for a long time. And then in 1980, Paul got the call. Steve was dying. Cancer, fast, aggressive. Paul went to see him one last time. He found him alone in a hospital room, thinner than he'd ever seen, but still somehow defiant. Steve looked up, smirked, and said, "You always were prettier than me." They talked for an hour about everything, about nothing. As Paul got up to leave, Steve reached into a drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside a pair of cufflinks, Paul had given them to him decades earlier. A joke at the time. Now Steve pressed them into his hand and said, "I don't know what we were, but I never forgot it." He died 3 weeks later. Paul never wore the cufflinks, but he kept them because sometimes the most powerful loves are the ones you never get to explain. "We were rivals," Paul said, "but somewhere between the fights and the silence, we became something else." John Derek, the one that was never meant to last. He wasn't like the others. There were no long nights of soul-bearing talks, no letters, no promises, just heat and youth. And two beautiful men who stumbled into each other at exactly the wrong time, or maybe the right one, depending on how you look at it. It was 1953, a rooftop party in Malibu. John was young, not yet a household name. His face belonged in museums, his body in dreams. He had that careless kind of beauty, the kind that didn't know it was rare and didn't need to. Paul was already in the middle of something complicated with someone else. But John smiled at him like none of it mattered, like the world didn't exist outside that balcony, like rules were for other people. They spent 3 days together, just 3. A borrowed beach house down the coast. Ocean air, salt in their hair, sand on the sheets. No scripts, no handlers, no past, no future, just the sound of the waves. And the way John whispered his name like a song he didn't want to forget. Paul never asked what John wanted. He didn't need to. This wasn't a beginning. It was a moment. On the last morning, Paul woke up to find John already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. He didn't say goodbye, just turned, grinned, and said, "We'll both be someone else by next year." And he was right. John went on to marry one of the most beautiful women in the world, Ursula Andress. Then Linda Evans, then Bo Derek. He became the man in the magazines, the director, the icon, the husband, the heterosexual fantasy. They saw each other twice more after that. Once at a red carpet event, a polite nod across a crowd, and once years later in a quiet bookstore in West Hollywood. They stood by the same shelf. Both older, a little heavier, a little slower, but the smile, it hadn't changed. John said, "I still remember the way you made coffee. Strong as hell, sweet as sin." And then he was gone again. Paul never called him an ex, never called it love, but he kept a Polaroid of those 3 days. The only photo from that weekend, just 2 shirtless men laughing mid-splash in the surf. The sun so bright it blurred their faces. He never framed it, never showed it, but he never threw it away. "Not every story needs a second chapter," Paul said once. "Some are meant to be just a page that you keep rereading for the rest of your life." When he finished speaking the 7th name, Paul Newman closed his eyes and rested for a long time. The recorder was still running, but he didn't say anything more. Not right away. Outside his window, the wind moved through the trees. The house was quiet, and for the first time in decades, so was he. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, I loved women. I loved my wife. I loved my family. But there were men too, and no one ever asked about them. So I stopped answering questions that were never asked. He didn't name them to shame them. He named them to set them free. For years they had been edited out of the frame, scrubbed from biographies, cropped from photographs, reduced to whispers in smoke-filled rooms. But now they had names again, stories, and a place in the truth. Rock, Carrie, Monty, Anthony, S., Steve, John, each one carried differently. Some were wounds, some were warmth. One was a ring in a box. Paul left no public letter, no big announcement, just a sealed package sent to UCLA's film archive. Inside, the tapes, the photos, the postcards, and a note in his handwriting. It read, "For the men I loved. In the only way I was allowed, let them be remembered. Not for the roles they played, but for the hearts they carried." Paul Newman died on September 26, 2008. The world remembered him as a movie star, a husband, a philanthropist. But there was more. There was the boy who kissed James Dean in the rain, the man who held Montgomery Clift through silence, the hands that once shook lighting a cigarette for Brando. And in the end, there was a voice on a tape recorder finally telling the story no one else dared to tell. Because in old Hollywood, loving another man could destroy your career, could erase your future, could break your soul. But being forgotten for it was the greater tragedy.